The night before the battle, the sky above Gaul was silent. Tens of thousands of soldiers lay restless in the dark, their armour cold, their banners still. At the centre of the camp, one man remained awake, a man raised to worship the sun, trained to serve Roman gods shaped by blood and ambition. His name was Constantine, and according to multiple witnesses, before sunrise he saw something no Roman emperor had ever claimed to see before. A symbol in the sky, a sign not from Mars, not from Jupiter, but from the God of the Christians, the very people his empire had hunted, tortured and executed for generations. By the next day, Constantine would march under a symbol once feared, and soon he would rule the largest empire on earth in the name of that forbidden faith. But the question history still cannot settle is simple. Did Constantine follow Christ, or did he bend Christ to his throne? When we speak of Rome in the 3rd century after Christ, we must first abandon any romantic notion of what religion meant in that world. The temples that lined the Forum, the altars that burned in every garrison, the sacrifices performed before every Senate session, these were not expressions of personal spirituality. They were the skeletal structure of political order itself. The Roman religious system was a mechanism of control so elegant that it barely needed to announce itself. Every citizen understood that the gods were not distant abstractions but active participants in the affairs of state. Jupiter did not simply exist in myth. He was invoked to legitimize the authority of magistrates. Mars was not merely a character in old stories. His favour was sought before every military campaign. The Vestal virgins who tended the sacred flame were not performing some quaint ritual. They were maintaining what Romans believed to be the literal protective barrier between civilization and chaos. At the apex of this system sat the emperor. He was not a god himself, not quite, but he was something perhaps more politically useful, the living intermediary between the divine realm and the human world. When the emperor spoke, he spoke with the implicit endorsement of the celestial order. When he commanded, his commands carried not just legal weight but cosmic authority. To obey the emperor was to obey the fundamental structure of reality itself. This was not superstition. This was statecraft of the highest order. The Roman Empire stretched from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the mists of Britain, encompassing dozens of languages, hundreds of distinct cultures, and countless local traditions. What held this impossibly diverse territory together was not merely legions, though the legions were certainly essential, but a shared framework of religious understanding. A merchant in Alexandria and a soldier in Germania might have nothing else in common, but they both understood that the emperor's authority derived from the gods, and that this divine mandate was what made their vast, interconnected world possible. Into this carefully calibrated system, Christianity arrived like a virus into a body. The Christians were not simply another exotic cult. Rome had absorbed countless foreign religions, Mithraism from Persia, the worship of Isis from Egypt, mystery religions from Greece. These posed no threat because they operated within the existing framework. Their adherents still acknowledged the Roman gods, they still participated in civic rituals, they still burned incense before the emperor's image. The Christians refused all of this. To Roman eyes, this refusal was not merely impious, it was incomprehensible. The Christians claimed to worship a god, yet they rejected all the other gods. They claimed to be loyal subjects, yet they would not perform the simple ritual acknowledgement of the emperor's divine status. They spoke of love and peace, yet they seemed to welcome persecution. They were, from the Roman perspective, atheists, people who denied the very existence of the divine order that made society possible. Worse, they were subversives. Their communities existed parallel to Roman civic life, but separate from it. They had their own leaders, their own texts, their own rituals performed in private. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world, which sounded to Roman ears very much like they were awaiting some other political order. They called each other brother and sister, which suggested a loyalty structure that superseded family and state. Their leader had been executed as a criminal, yet they worshipped him as divine, which implied that Roman justice itself had been in error. From a Roman standpoint, these people were dangerous not because they were violent, but because they represented an alternative architecture of reality. They suggested that one could be a good person, a moral person, a saved person, without participating in the civic religious system that held the empire together. If this idea spread widely enough, the entire structure might collapse. And it was spreading. Despite everything Rome threw at it, Christianity was spreading. The persecutions had been intermittent but vicious. Under Nero, Christians had been burned alive as human torches to light imperial gardens. Under Marcus Aurelius, that philosopher-emperor so admired by history, Christian martyrs were fed to animals in public arenas. Under Decius, a systematic empire-wide persecution had attempted to force every Christian to sacrifice to the Roman gods or face execution. Each wave of persecution had been intended to eliminate the threat. Each had failed. By the time Diocletian became emperor in 284 AD, Christianity had survived more than 2 centuries of Roman hostility. It had spread to every province. It had adherents in every social class. It had developed sophisticated theology, complex organizational structures, and a powerful narrative of martyrdom that seemed to attract new believers even as old ones died. Diocletian was a brilliant administrator who had restored stability to an empire that had nearly collapsed into civil war. He recognized that the Christian problem had grown beyond what sporadic local persecutions could address. If Christianity was a disease in the body of the empire, it required not isolated treatments but systematic surgery. The Great Persecution began in 303 AD. The imperial edicts came in waves, each more severe than the last. First, Christian churches were to be destroyed and Christian scriptures burned. Then Christian clergy were to be arrested and forced to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Then all Christians, regardless of rank, were to be compelled to participate in pagan worship or face death. Property was confiscated. Legal rights were stripped. Torture was authorized to compel compliance. The machinery of the Roman state, which had conquered the known world, turned its full attention to eliminating a religious movement. It failed. The persecution raged for 8 years. Thousands died. Thousands more apostatized, renouncing their faith to save their lives. But thousands remained, and new believers continued to emerge. The persecution did not eliminate Christianity. It may have even strengthened it, giving it a fresh generation of martyrs whose stories would be told for centuries. Into this world of systematic religious violence, Constantine was born around 272 AD. He was the son of Constantius Chlorus, a military commander who would eventually become one of the 4 emperors ruling the divided empire under Diocletian's tetrarchy system. Constantine grew up in imperial palaces, was educated in Greek and Latin, trained in military command and taught to understand the world through the lens of Roman power. He also grew up watching the persecution fail. His father Constantius was unusual among the tetrarchs. While the other emperors enforced the anti-Christian edicts with varying degrees of enthusiasm, Constantius was notably lenient. In the territories under his control, Gaul and Britain, the persecution was enforced minimally or not at all. Churches might be demolished to satisfy the letter of the law, but executions were rare. This was not because Constantius was himself a Christian. He was not. But because he was a pragmatist who recognized that persecution was creating more problems than it solved. Constantine learned this lesson. He saw that violence against Christians did not eliminate Christian belief. He saw that martyrdom created heroes. He saw that persecution drove the movement underground where it was harder to monitor and control. He saw, perhaps most importantly, that Christianity possessed something that gave it resilience beyond what military force could break. But at this stage of his life, Constantine was not a Christian. He was a Roman soldier and a Roman politician, raised to worship the traditional gods, particularly Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, whose cult had become popular among the military class. He understood religion as a tool of power, not as a source of personal salvation. This understanding would serve him well, because very soon Constantine would need every tool available to him. The empire was fracturing, the tetrarchy was collapsing into civil war, and Constantine, ambitious and capable, saw an opportunity. The question was not whether he would seize power. The question was which gods he would invoke to claim it. To understand what Constantine became, we must first understand what he was, a product of the Roman military aristocracy at the moment when that system was tearing itself apart. The Roman Empire in the late 3rd century was not the confident, expanding power of previous eras. It was an exhausted giant, beset by internal divisions and external pressures. The crisis of the 3rd century had seen the empire fragment into competing territories, with more than 50 men claiming imperial authority over a 50-year period. Emperors were made and unmade by their armies. Frontiers collapsed under barbarian invasions. The economy spiraled into chaos as currency was debased. The very concept of Rome as a unified political entity seemed on the verge of becoming a historical memory. Diocletian had arrested this collapse through sheer administrative genius. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by a senior emperor called an Augustus, with a junior emperor called a Caesar, designated as his successor. This tetrarchy, ruled by 4, was meant to provide stability through clear lines of succession and distributed military power. Each emperor would focus on defending and administering his portion of the empire. When an Augustus died or retired, his Caesar would step up, appoint a new Caesar, and the system would continue. It was a brilliant solution to the problem of imperial instability. It was also doomed from the start because it assumed that ambitious men would voluntarily accept limitations on their power. Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus, was Caesar and then Augustus of the western provinces, Gaul, Britain, and Hispania. He was a capable military commander who had restored Roman control in Britain and strengthened the Rhine frontier against Germanic invasions. Constantine grew up in his father's court, learning the art of warfare, the mechanics of administration, and the essential truth of Roman politics. Power flowed from the loyalty of armies. But Constantine spent much of his youth not with his father, but as a virtual hostage in the court of Diocletian in the east. This was standard practice in the Tetrarchy. Keeping the sons of emperors close ensured their father's loyalty. Constantine received the education of a prince, studied Greek philosophy and Roman history, and was trained in military command. He also observed firsthand the working of the Great Persecution, watching as Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in the streets of Nicomedia. What did he think about this? We do not know. Constantine left no personal writings from this period. What we do know is that he survived, a skill that would prove essential in the years to come. When Diocletian and his co-emperor Maximian abdicated in 305 AD, an unprecedented voluntary surrender of power, the Tetrarchy system immediately began to fracture. Constantius became Augustus of the West, and Constantine, now in his 30s, finally escaped the Eastern Court to join his father's campaigns in Britain. For 1 year, father and son fought together against the Picts beyond Hadrian's Wall. Then Constantius died at York in 306 AD. The army immediately proclaimed Constantine as Augustus. This was not how the Tetrarchy was supposed to work. Constantine had not been designated as Caesar. He had not been approved by the other emperors. He was simply the son of a dead emperor, declared as successor by soldiers who expected rewards for their loyalty. It was exactly the kind of military usurpation that the Tetrarchy had been designed to prevent. Constantine accepted the acclamation. He also significantly wrote to the senior Augustus, Galerius, asking for official recognition. He was willing to be named Caesar if that would avoid civil war. Galerius, recognizing that he lacked the military strength to challenge Constantine in Britain and Gaul, grudgingly agreed. But the system was already breaking down. Maxentius, son of the retired Emperor Maximian, seized power in Rome and declared himself Augustus. Maximian himself came out of retirement and tried to reclaim power. In the east, Galerius and his Caesar Maximinus Dia manoeuvred for advantage. By 310 AD, there were no fewer than 4 men claiming to be Augustus simultaneously, and the empire was effectively in a state of civil war. Constantine spent these years consolidating control over Gaul and Britain, fighting Germanic invaders along the Rhine, and building the loyalty of his army. He was a gifted military commander, aggressive, tactically creative, and personally courageous. He was also a capable administrator who maintained the functioning of government even while preparing for war. And he was a skilled propagandist who understood that military power needed to be wrapped in claims of legitimacy. This is where religion entered his political calculations. Constantine minted coins showing himself crowned by Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This was a strategic choice. The cult of Sol Invictus was popular among soldiers, who saw the sun's daily victory over darkness as a metaphor for military triumph. It was also vague enough to be inoffensive to most pagans, who could see in Sol Invictus echoes of Apollo or other solar deities. Constantine presented himself as the favourite of the unconquered sun, the emperor chosen by the cosmic force that drove back darkness and brought light to the world. This was Constantine before Christianity entered the picture, a capable, ambitious military commander using traditional Roman religious imagery to legitimize his power. He was not a particularly pious man, he was not a philosopher seeking truth. He was a soldier-politician who understood that controlling how people thought about divine authority was part of controlling political authority. But the situation was escalating toward a final confrontation. Maxentius controlled Rome, the symbolic heart of the empire. He had the prestige of holding the capital. He had the wealth of the Italian peninsula. He had legitimacy in the eyes of the Senate, which had recognized him as Augustus. Constantine controlled the wealthy provinces of Gaul and Britain, but without Rome, his claim to be ruler of the West was incomplete. By 312 AD, both men understood that the conflict would have to be resolved by force. Constantine made the decision to invade Italy. It was an enormous gamble. Maxentius had larger forces. He controlled fortified positions. He could fight a defensive war, forcing Constantine to extend his supply lines and exhaust his army in siege warfare. Every rational military calculation suggested that Constantine should wait, build strength, and seek allies. Constantine marched anyway. He took a relatively small mobile force, perhaps 40,000 men, and moved with shocking speed through the Alps into northern Italy. He defeated Maxentius's armies in 2 preliminary battles at Turin and Verona, using cavalry charges and tactical aggression to overcome superior numbers. By October 312, Constantine's army was approaching Rome itself. Maxentius had every advantage. He controlled the walls of Rome, which were virtually impregnable. He had sufficient supplies to withstand a long siege. He had the Tiber River as a defensive barrier. The rational strategy would have been to stay behind the walls and let Constantine's army waste itself. Instead, Maxentius chose to meet Constantine in open battle north of the river. Why? The sources suggest that pagan priests consulting their omens told Maxentius that victory was assured. Another account claims that the Roman people, restless under Maxentius's rule, were pressuring him to act decisively. Whatever the reason, Maxentius marched his forces out of the city and across the Tiber, using the Milvian Bridge and a temporary pontoon bridge to move his larger army into position. Constantine's forces were outnumbered, possibly by as much as 2-1. His supply lines were extended. He was far from his base of power. If he lost this battle, he would lose everything: his army, his provinces, his life. On the night before the battle, Constantine was desperate for any advantage he could find. And according to the sources that survive, something happened. October 27th, 312 AD, the plain north of Rome. Two armies facing each other across the field where Roman history would pivot. Constantine's forces were exhausted from the march through Italy. They had won battles through speed and aggression, but now they faced the full strength of Maxentius's army drawn up in formation. The Tiber River was at Maxentius's back, a dangerous position that limited his options for retreat but also demonstrated his confidence. This would be a decisive battle. Winner takes Rome. Winner takes the Western Empire. Loser dies. Constantine had led his men to this moment through a combination of military skill and calculated risk. But he was a Roman commander, which meant he understood that morale was as important as tactics. Soldiers needed to believe that the gods favoured their cause. They needed to believe that victory was not just possible but inevitable, written into the cosmic order itself. The problem was that Maxentius controlled Rome, which meant he controlled the traditional religious apparatus of the state. He had the Senate's priests performing sacrifices. He had access to the old auguries and omens. He could claim with some legitimacy that he was defending the sacred city itself against a usurper from the provinces. Constantine needed something to counter this. He needed a divine endorsement that was powerful enough to convince his soldiers that they were fighting on the side of cosmic justice. What happened next depends on which sources you trust. The earliest account comes from Lactantius, a Christian scholar who was actually serving as tutor to Constantine's son at the time. Writing just a few years after the battle, Lactantius claims that Constantine received a dream the night before the battle. In this dream, he was commanded to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol, specifically the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek, superimposed to form a monogram. Constantine obeyed, had his soldiers mark their shields, and won the battle. This is a straightforward account. Divine dream, religious symbol, military victory. It places the supernatural intervention in the private space of Constantine's sleep, involves a clear command, and attributes the victory to Christian divine power. But there is another account, more dramatic and more problematic. Eusebius, the bishop who had become Constantine's primary biographer, wrote a more elaborate version decades later. In Eusebius's telling, Constantine saw a vision not in a dream but in the sky during daylight, and not just before the battle, but during the march toward Rome. According to this account, Constantine and his entire army saw a cross of light superimposed on the sun, accompanied by words in Greek, on tuto nika. In this sign, conquer. That night, according to Eusebius, Christ himself appeared to Constantine in a dream and commanded him to make a military standard, the labarum, bearing the Chi Rho symbol. Constantine did so, carried this Christian banner into battle, and won. Eusebius claims that Constantine himself told him this story years later, and that he swore an oath that it was true. There are immediate problems with this account. First, Eusebius wrote it decades after the event in his Life of Constantine, which was completed after the emperor's death. This is not contemporary testimony. It is a hagiography written to portray Constantine as a divinely chosen Christian ruler. Second, no other source mentions the vision in the sky. Lactantius, writing much closer to the events, mentions only the dream. No pagan historians record anything unusual in the sky. If Constantine's entire army had witnessed a miraculous sign, one might expect some corroboration beyond Eusebius's later claim. Third, the political usefulness of such a story is obvious. By the time Eusebius was writing, Constantine had ruled for decades as a Christian emperor. The church had become a central institution of the state. Christianity had gone from persecuted sect to imperial religion. In this context, a story establishing that God himself had directly intervened to place Constantine on the throne, served powerful legitimizing functions. But there is also evidence that something happened. Constantine did adopt the Chi-Rho symbol. This is not disputed. Coins, military standards, and inscriptions from Constantine's reign consistently feature this Christian monogram. The labarum, the military standard bearing the Chi-Rho, became one of the most recognizable symbols of his rule. Constantine consistently attributed his victory at the Milvian Bridge to divine Christian intervention, not just in his later years, but relatively soon after the battle. Moreover, he seems to have been genuinely convinced. Constantine was a shrewd political operator who understood the value of religious propaganda, but he was also willing to take concrete actions based on his conviction that the Christian God had granted him victory. Within months of the battle, he began issuing edicts favourable to Christians. He returned confiscated property. He exempted Christian clergy from certain taxes. He began building churches. This does not prove that the vision happened as Eusebius described it, but it suggests that something occurred, whether mystical experience, psychological crisis, or calculated political theatre, that convinced Constantine to align himself with Christianity at a moment when doing so was not obviously advantageous. Because we must be clear about this, in 312 AD, Christianity was still a minority religion associated with persecution, martyrdom, and separation from traditional Roman values. The majority of Constantine's soldiers were not Christian. The Senate was not Christian. The aristocracy was not Christian. By adopting Christian symbols, Constantine was taking a genuine risk. If he lost the battle, his embrace of the Christian God would be remembered as the delusion of a failed usurper. But he did not lose. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge turned on Maxentius's fatal error of leaving the security of Rome's walls. Once committed to open battle, his larger army became a liability. The fighting was brutal and close, but Constantine's forces, hardened by their campaign through Italy and unified by whatever conviction Constantine had instilled in them, broke Maxentius's lines. The retreat became a catastrophe. Maxentius's forces fled back toward the Tiber, trying to cross the bridges while Constantine's cavalry pursued. The temporary pontoon bridge collapsed under the weight of fleeing soldiers. Thousands drowned in the river. Maxentius himself died in the chaos. Whether drowned, trampled, or killed in the fighting is unclear. His body was recovered from the Tiber the next day. Constantine entered Rome on October 29, 312 AD, as the undisputed master of the Western Empire. The Senate immediately recognized him as Augustus. The people celebrated their liberation from Maxentius's rule. Maxentius's memory was condemned, his statues toppled, his name chiselled from inscriptions, his supporters purged. Constantine was the victor, and in Rome the victor wrote history. But Constantine did something unusual in his victory. He did not primarily credit the traditional Roman gods. He did not offer the customary sacrifices to Jupiter Optimus Maximus in the Capitol. Instead, he began speaking of a divine Christian intervention that had granted him victory. This was strange. This was unprecedented. Roman emperors routinely credited the gods for military success, but they credited the Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Victoria. Constantine was crediting the god of a religion that Rome had been trying to exterminate just a few years earlier. The Senate erected an arch in Constantine's honour, and its inscription is revealing. It attributes his victory to the inspiration of divinity, instinctu divinitatis, a deliberately vague phrase that could be interpreted as either pagan or Christian. Constantine allowed this ambiguity. He did not demand that the Senate explicitly acknowledge the Christian God. He was content for now to let people interpret his divine favour according to their own beliefs. Because Constantine was many things, but he was not naive. He knew that he ruled an empire that was still overwhelmingly pagan. He knew that openly antagonizing the traditional religious establishment would create unnecessary resistance. He knew that successful political transformation required patience, not revolutionary proclamations. So he moved carefully. He continued to hold the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman pagan religion. He continued to appear on coins with solar imagery. He continued to participate in certain traditional ceremonies. To casual observers, Constantine might have seemed like any other Roman emperor making use of religious imagery to legitimize his rule. But beneath this surface continuity, something fundamental had shifted. Constantine had decided that Christianity was not a threat to be eliminated, but a resource to be harnessed. He had recognized that the religion which had survived everything Rome could throw at it possessed organizational strength, ideological coherence, and a motivated base of believers that could serve imperial purposes. Most importantly, he had concluded, whether through genuine belief or calculated reasoning, that the Christian God was real and powerful. This was the hinge moment. Everything that came after, the transformation of Christianity from persecuted sect to state religion, the debates over doctrine that would tear the church apart, the suppression of alternative Christian texts, the marriage of faith and imperial power, all of it flowed from this decision by this man in this moment. But the question remains, was this a conversion or a calculation? Did Constantine truly see a sign from God, experience a genuine spiritual transformation, and dedicate himself to Christ? Or did he recognize that Christianity's organizational structure, universal appeal, and history of resistance to persecution made it the perfect ideological foundation for imperial unity, and cynically adopt its imagery while bending it to serve his political goals? The answer may be that these are not mutually exclusive options. Constantine may have genuinely believed in the Christian God's power while simultaneously understanding Christianity's political utility. He may have experienced something he interpreted as divine intervention, while also recognizing how to use that experience for propaganda. He may have been both sincere believer and calculating emperor. What is undeniable is that from this moment forward, Christianity and imperial power would be inseparably intertwined. The faith that had defined itself through martyrdom and separation from worldly authority was about to become the official voice of the most powerful state on earth, and that transformation would come at a cost that the martyrs could never have imagined. The problem with miracles is that they leave no physical evidence. What remains are stories, told by people with agendas, written down years or decades after the events they describe, copied and recopied by scribes who might add or subtract details according to their own understanding of what must have happened. This is the situation we face when trying to determine what Constantine actually experienced before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. We have Lactantius, writing around 314 AD, just 2 years after the battle. His account is brief and relatively restrained. Constantine had a dream. In the dream, he was instructed to mark his soldiers' shields with the Chi-Rho symbol. He did so. He won the battle. The implication is clear. The Christian God intervened to grant Constantine victory. Lactantius was a Christian scholar, so we might expect him to present the story in a way favourable to Christianity. But his account has the advantage of proximity. He was writing when many witnesses to the battle would still have been alive. He was part of Constantine's court. He could not fabricate details so wildly at variance with what people remembered without risking his credibility. Then we have Eusebius, writing in the 3 more than 20 years after the battle. His account is much more elaborate. The vision was not a private dream, but a public sky phenomenon witnessed by the entire army. Christ appeared to Constantine personally. The Labarum was constructed according to divine instructions. The whole event is presented as an unmistakable miracle, a moment when heaven directly intervened in human affairs. Eusebius explicitly claims that Constantine told him this story personally and swore to its truth. This should carry weight. a bishop recording the sworn testimony of an emperor. But Eusebius was also Constantine's official biographer, writing after the emperor's death, with full knowledge of how the Christian transformation of the empire had unfolded. His Life of Constantine is not neutral history. It is an argument that Constantine was divinely chosen, that his reign represented God's plan for Christianity, and that the union of church and empire was providential. Modern historians debate these accounts endlessly. Some accept Eusebius's version as essentially accurate, arguing that he would not have fabricated a story claiming to be Constantine's direct testimony. Others dismiss it as pious legend that grew in the telling, with the more dramatic elements added years later to serve theological purposes. Still others try to find middle ground, suggesting that Constantine experienced something, perhaps a solar halo phenomenon that he interpreted religiously, which was then elaborated over time into the more miraculous account. But here is what we can establish with confidence. Constantine adopted Christian symbols before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The Chairo appears on his military standard soon after, if not immediately before the battle. This is not disputed by any source. Constantine attributed his victory to the Christian God. He did this publicly, consistently, and with the concrete policy changes to back up the claim. This was not a casual or private matter. It was a political and religious statement. Constantine's adoption of Christianity was gradual and strategic. He did not immediately declare himself a Christian or demand that the empire convert. He moved carefully, maintaining pagan symbols alongside Christian ones, participating in traditional ceremonies while also building churches and favouring Christian clergy. This last point is crucial. If Constantine had simply wanted to use Christianity as propaganda, he could have made much more dramatic moves much faster. The fact that he proceeded carefully, maintaining dual religious identities for years, suggests that he was navigating between genuine belief and political reality. Consider the coins minted during Constantine's reign. In the years immediately after 312, Constantine's coins still feature Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The solar imagery continues throughout the 310s. It is only gradually, over the course of the next decade, that explicitly Christian symbols become dominant and pagan imagery fades. This is not the pattern of a revolutionary, it is the pattern of a politician managing a transition. Constantine also continued to hold the title of Pontifex Maximus, the supreme priest of the Roman pagan religion. This was not merely honorary. The Pontifex Maximus had specific religious duties, including overseeing the state cults and maintaining the traditional rituals that supposedly protected Rome. Every emperor since Augustus had held this title. Constantine continued to hold it even as he was simultaneously building Christian churches and consulting with bishops. How do we reconcile this? How was Constantine simultaneously the protector of Christianity and the chief priest of paganism? The answer is that Constantine understood he was ruling an empire in transition. The majority of his subjects were still pagan. The majority of his administrators were pagan. The Senate was pagan. The army was largely pagan. To maintain stability, Constantine needed to avoid unnecessarily antagonizing these constituencies. He could favor Christianity, promote Christian clergy, build Christian churches, and gradually shift the empire's religious center of gravity, but he could not do it all at once without risking civil war. So he maintained the forms of pagan respectability while working to transform the substance of religious power. This required a delicate balance. Constantine had to convince Christians that he was genuinely one of them, that his conversion was real, that he could be trusted with power over the church. At the same time, he had to reassure pagans that he was not about to overturn the entire social order, that traditional practices would continue, that the change would be gradual and manageable. The ambiguity about exactly what Constantine saw before the Milvian Bridge served this purpose. Christians could believe he had experienced a genuine miracle, direct divine intervention that validated Christianity's truth. Pagans could interpret it more vaguely. Perhaps Constantine had received a favourable omen. Perhaps he had experienced a vision that could be understood in terms of solar divinity. Perhaps the Christian God was simply being added to the pantheon of divine powers rather than replacing them. Constantine seems to have deliberately cultivated this ambiguity. He spoke of his vision in terms that could be interpreted multiple ways. He allowed different accounts to circulate. He did not demand that everyone accept a single orthodox version of what happened. This ambiguity extended to the question of what the Christian God had actually promised. According to the sources, the message was, "In this sign conquer, not in this sign be saved, not in this sign find eternal life." Conquer. The divine message was about power, victory, military success, concerns that any Roman emperor would recognize. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was Constantine's Christianity from the beginning a religion of power rather than a religion of salvation? Traditional Christianity, the Christianity of the martyrs and the underground churches, had defined itself against Roman power. It had preached that the kingdom of God was not of this world. It had taught that worldly authority was temporary and spiritually meaningless. It had insisted that faith meant being willing to die rather than compromise with the state. Constantine's Christianity was different. His Christianity said that God intervened in military battles. His Christianity said that the true faith would be victorious in this world, not just the next. His Christianity allied itself with imperial power rather than opposing it. Was this a betrayal of original Christianity? Or was it simply Christianity adapting to new circumstances, recognizing that if the faith was going to survive and spread, it needed to work with power rather than against it? These questions would become urgent very quickly, because within a year of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine would begin issuing edicts that fundamentally altered Christianity's legal and social status. The underground church was about to become an imperial institution, and once Christianity possessed state power, it would have to decide what to do with it. The actual battle was brief and brutal. Ancient sources give us fragments, cavalry charges, infantry clashes, the chaos of the river crossing, the collapse of the pontoon bridge, but the details matter less than the result. Maxentius dead, his army destroyed, Constantine master of Rome. The Tiber that day ran red with the blood of Roman soldiers killing each other for control of an empire, the river that had witnessed Rome's rise from a collection of villages to the greatest power on earth now witnessed Romans slaughtering Romans in the name of competing visions of who should rule. This was the reality behind the vision in the sky. Whatever Constantine saw or claimed to see, whatever divine intervention he experienced or imagined, it ended with thousands of men drowning in a river, crushed under the weight of other fleeing men, or cut down by cavalry as they tried to escape. Constantine framed this as divine justice. Maxentius had been a tyrant, his rule illegitimate, his death deserved. The Christian God had intervened not with mercy but with military victory, granting Constantine the power to reshape the empire according to divine will. This was a very different Christianity from what had existed before. The Christianity of the martyrs had been about suffering, about maintaining faith despite persecution, about the promise of salvation in the next world since this world was hostile and corrupt. It had been a religion of the powerless, offering meaning and hope to people who had no leverage in the existing political system. Constantine's Christianity was about winning. It was about conquest. It was about God's favour manifesting as military and political success. It was a religion for emperors. When Constantine entered Rome on October 29th, 312 AD, he did not enter as a humble servant of Christ. He entered in triumph, with all the pageantry and symbolism of Roman imperial power. The Senate met him. The people cheered. His image was set up in the Forum. He was addressed as Augustus, as Dominus, as the supreme authority in the West. but he also made sure people knew that he attributed his victory to the Christian God. This was the beginning of a propaganda campaign that would continue throughout his reign. Constantine consistently presented himself as chosen by God, favoured by divine providence, the instrument through which Christianity would achieve its destiny. Every victory was attributed to divine favour. Every success was evidence of God's approval. This served multiple purposes. It legitimised Constantine's rule, suggesting that opposition to him was opposition to God's will. It elevated Christianity from persecuted sect to divinely mandated religion, and it positioned Constantine himself as the mediator between God and the empire. Not merely a political ruler, but a religious figure with special access to divine truth. But Constantine was not yet ready to fully embrace Christian identity or impose it on the empire. Throughout 313 and into the following years, Constantine maintained careful ambiguity about his personal religious commitment. He built Christian churches, but he also continued traditional pagan practices. He consulted with Christian bishops, but he also maintained the traditional religious offices of the Roman state. He spoke of the Christian God's favour, but he also continued to use pagan religious imagery on his coins and monuments. The Arch of Constantine, erected by the Senate to commemorate his victory, exemplifies this ambiguity. Its inscription credits Constantine's success to the inspiration of divinity, instinctu divinitatis, a deliberately vague phrase. The arch's decorative program includes traditional Roman gods and imagery, with no explicitly Christian content. Yet Christians could see in it an acknowledgement of their god's power, while pagans could interpret it according to traditional categories. Constantine approved this ambiguity. He understood that transforming the religious identity of the empire would take time and would require allowing different groups to interpret his actions according to their own frameworks. But while Constantine maintained this public ambiguity, he was simultaneously taking concrete steps to elevate Christianity's legal and institutional status. The most important of these steps came in February 313 AD, when Constantine met with Licinius, the emperor controlling the eastern provinces, in Milan. The two emperors were now allies. Constantine had just helped Licinius defeat another rival claimant, and Licinius had married Constantine's half-sister. Together they issued what became known as the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was not technically an edict, and it was not actually issued from Milan, but its contents were revolutionary. It granted Christianity full legal recognition throughout the empire. Christians could worship freely, without fear of persecution. Christian churches became legal entities that could own property. Property that had been confiscated during the persecutions was to be returned. Christian clergy were exempted from certain civic duties. Crucially, the edict also granted religious freedom to followers of all religions. It did not ban paganism. It did not declare Christianity the official religion of the empire. It simply ended the persecution and created a legal framework in which Christianity could exist openly. This was presented as religious tolerance, as a magnanimous gesture by a victorious emperor. But it was also a strategic masterstroke. By legalizing Christianity without banning paganism, Constantine avoided creating a massive pagan resistance movement. Pagans could continue their practices, maintain their temples, perform their rituals. Nothing was being taken from them, at least not immediately. But Christians received something extraordinary: legitimacy. After centuries of existing as an illegal religion, subject to periodic persecution, Christians could now build churches in the open, hold services publicly, own property collectively, and participate in civic life without hiding their faith. The psychological and practical impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Christianity went from being a religion of the underground, of secret meetings and hidden texts, to being a legally protected institution. Bishops who had previously risked arrest simply for being identified as church leaders could now correspond with imperial officials, petition the emperor directly, and expect state protection for their activities. Constantine went further. He didn't just legalize Christianity, he actively promoted it. He funded church construction. He exempted Christian clergy from certain taxes. He gave bishops authority to act as judges in civil disputes. He returned confiscated Christian property and compensated churches that had been destroyed. This imperial patronage transformed Christianity's institutional capacity almost overnight. Churches that had been meeting in homes could now construct dedicated buildings. Bishops who had been operating with minimal resources could now maintain professional staffs. Christian charity networks could expand and formalize. The church could become an organized, visible presence in every major city. But this transformation came with strings attached. Christianity now owed Constantine. He had given the church legal status, financial support and protection. In return, Constantine expected loyalty, cooperation, and support for his rule. This expectation would become explicit very quickly, because Constantine didn't just want Christianity to exist, he wanted it to serve as a unifying force for the empire, and that required that Christianity itself be unified, which was when Constantine discovered that Christians did not agree on what Christianity actually meant. The traditional narrative presents the Edict of Milan as pure religious liberation, the moment when Christianity was freed from persecution and given the space to flourish. This narrative is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete. What Constantine granted in 313 AD was not just tolerance, but partnership. Christianity was becoming a junior partner in the imperial governance, with all the benefits and compraises that implied. Consider what Constantine actually did in the immediate aftermath of Milan. He wrote to Anlinus, the proconsul of Africa, instructing him to return all church property that had been confiscated. This sounds straightforward until you realize that determining what counted as church property required the state to recognize which groups were legitimate churches. Constantine was effectively deciding who represented authentic Christianity. He exempted Christian clergy from munera, the obligatory public services that Roman citizens owed to their cities. This was an extraordinary privilege, typically reserved for a few professions like doctors and teachers. It meant that Christian priests and bishops would not be required to serve on city councils, fund public works, or participate in pagan religious ceremonies. It also created a powerful incentive for men to seek positions in the church hierarchy. Christian ordination now brought tangible legal and financial benefits. He granted bishops the authority to act as judges in certain civil disputes, with their decisions recognized by secular courts. This gave the church direct participation in the Roman legal system, transforming bishops from purely religious leaders into figures wielding state-backed authority. He commissioned the construction of major churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. These were not modest structures. They were monumental buildings designed to compete with pagan temples in grandeur and visibility. Constantine was using imperial resources to make Christianity architecturally dominant in the urban landscape. All of this happened within a few years of Milan. Constantine was not passively allowing Christianity to exist. He was actively building Christianity into the empire's institutional structure. Why? What did Constantine gain from this arrangement? The standard answer is that Constantine had genuinely converted and wanted to promote the faith he now believed. This may be true, but there were also concrete political advantages to elevating Christianity. Christianity had something that paganism lacked: organizational unity. Pagan religion was a collection of local cults, traditional practices, and philosophical schools with no central authority. Different cities worshipped different gods. Different social classes practiced different forms of piety. There was no pagan equivalent to bishops who could speak for all worshippers of Jupiter, no pagan texts that defined correct belief for everyone. Christianity, in contrast, had bishops organised in a hierarchy. It had sacred texts, even if there was debate about which texts were authoritative. It had a defined identity. Christians knew who was Christian and who was not. Most importantly, it had a tradition of communities staying in communication across vast distances, creating networks that cut across regional and ethnic divisions. From an emperor's perspective, this was enormously valuable. If Constantine could align Christianity with imperial interests, he would have a ready-made system for communicating with and organising populations throughout the empire. Bishops could serve as local administrators. Churches could serve as sites for imperial announcements. Christian networks could become channels for imperial policy. But this only worked if Christians were unified. If Christianity fragmented into competing factions, it would become a source of conflict rather than cohesion. The religion would create divisions rather than bridge them. Unfortunately for Constantine, Christianity was already fragmenting. The decades of persecution had created deep divisions within Christian communities. Some Christians had remained faithful under torture and faced death rather than renounce their beliefs. Others had complied with imperial demands, handing over scriptures, offering sacrifices to pagan gods, or even betraying fellow Christians to the authorities. After the persecution ended, the question of what to do with these lapsed Christians became explosive. In North Africa, a movement called Donatism insisted that clergy who had collaborated with persecutors had forfeited their spiritual authority. Sacraments performed by such clergy were invalid. The church needed to be purified of traitors. A rival hierarchy of bishops was established, claiming to represent authentic Christianity against the compromised mainstream church. Constantine found himself almost immediately having to adjudicate between competing groups of Christians, each claiming to be the true church. He sided with the mainstream bishops against the Donatists, but this only created more problems. Now the emperor was directly involved in determining Christian orthodoxy. His political authority was being used to settle theological disputes. Even more troubling, different regions had different theological traditions. Christians in the East thought about doctrine differently from Christians in the West. Greek-speaking Christians used philosophical concepts that Latin-speaking Christians found alien. There were debates about the nature of Christ, the meaning of salvation, the authority of bishops, the content of Scripture, debates that had been simmering for decades and were now erupting into open conflict. Constantine discovered that Christianity was not one thing but many things. There was no single agreed-upon Christianity that he could simply adopt and promote. Every theological question had multiple answers, each defended passionately by communities that saw their understanding as essential to salvation. This was a problem. Constantine wanted Christianity to unify the empire. But if Christians couldn't agree on what Christianity meant, how could the religion serve that purpose? Constantine's solution would be to use imperial power to create unity. He would summon bishops, convene councils, and employ the machinery of the state to force consensus. He would, in effect, make Christianity into what he needed it to be. But first, the conflict had to get much worse. Because the most dangerous theological dispute was just beginning, and it would threaten to tear apart not just the church, but the empire itself. By the early 320s, Constantine controlled the entire Roman Empire, having defeated Licinius in a civil war that reunited East and West under a single ruler. He was the most powerful man in the world, commander of the mightiest military force in existence, master of territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, and he was losing control of Christianity. The problem began, like so many theological controversies, with a priest trying to explain the unexplainable. Aris was a popular preacher in Alexandria, known for his learning and his ability to express complex ideas in clear language. He was trying to address a question that Christians have been struggling with since the beginning. If Jesus is divine, and God the Father is divine, are there two gods? And if not, How can both be God without Christianity becoming polytheistic? Arius's answer was logical, philosophically coherent, and completely unacceptable to many other Christians. He argued that God the Father was the only truly eternal being. Jesus, the Son, was divine but created, the first and greatest of God's creations, through whom everything else was made, but nonetheless a created being rather than an eternal one. This preserved monotheism. There was one uncreated God, and Jesus, while exalted far above all other creatures, was fundamentally subordinate to the Father. This made sense to Arius. It resolved the logical problems. It maintained the distinction between the uncreated God and the created universe. It preserved God's absolute uniqueness. But to his opponents, this was heresy. Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, was horrified. If Jesus was a created being, then Christianity was worshipping a creature rather than the Creator. If Jesus was not fully divine, then the salvation Christians claimed to have through Christ was meaningless. How could a mere creature, however exalted, bridge the infinite gap between humanity and God? The debate exploded. Arius was a skilled writer and had many followers, particularly among the educated classes who appreciated his philosophical rigor. He began writing letters, composing hymns, spreading his understanding of Christ's nature throughout the Eastern Empire. Alexander condemned him, called local councils of bishops, and tried to have Arius's teachings suppressed, but the suppression didn't work. The controversy spread. Bishops took sides. Some defended Arius, arguing that his position was the logical conclusion of biblical monotheism. Others condemned him, insisting that only a fully divine Christ could accomplish salvation. Cities became divided, congregations split, violence broke out. Constantine was furious. From his perspective, this was insane. He had just reunited the empire through years of civil war. He had elevated Christianity specifically because he believed it could serve as a unifying force. And now Christians were fighting each other over what seemed to him an absurdly abstract question about the nature of divinity. Constantine wrote an exasperated letter to both Arius and Alexander, essentially telling them to stop arguing about things that didn't matter. He compared the dispute to philosophical quibbling. He urged them to reconcile, to remember what they had in common, rather than obsessing over minor differences. This letter reveals something crucial about Constantine's understanding of Christianity. He didn't grasp or didn't care about the theological subtleties that Christians found essential. To him, doctrine was secondary to unity. The specific content of belief mattered less than the fact of shared religious identity. Christianity's value was political and social, not primarily theological. But Christians couldn't accept this. To them, the question of Christ's nature was not a trivial philosophical puzzle. It went to the heart of salvation itself. If Christ was a creature, then worshipping him was idolatry. If Christ was fully divine, then Arius was teaching a false gospel. These were not minor differences. These were matters of eternal salvation versus eternal damnation. The controversy continued to escalate. Riots broke out in Alexandria. Bishops excommunicated each other. The conflict was spreading beyond the church, creating social instability in major cities. Constantine realized that his letter had changed nothing. Theological disputes were not going to be resolved through imperial appeals for moderation. If Christianity was going to serve as a unifying force for the empire, Constantine would have to actively intervene to create uniformity. He would have to use imperial power not just to protect Christianity, but to define what Christianity was. This was a momentous decision. Roman emperors had always been involved in religion, but traditional Roman religion had never required uniformity of belief. Different people worshipped different gods, practiced different rituals, held different theological opinions. As long as everyone participated in civic ceremonies and acknowledged the emperor's authority, personal beliefs were largely irrelevant. Christianity was different. Christianity insisted that belief mattered, that incorrect beliefs were dangerous, that salvation depended on accepting true doctrine. This meant that theological disputes had practical consequences. People who believed the wrong things couldn't simply be allowed to continue in their error. They had to be corrected, and if they refused correction, they had to be excluded. Constantine decided that if Christians couldn't unify themselves, he would unify them. He would convene a council of all the bishops in the empire, bring them together in one place, force them to debate the issues, and arrive at a definitive answer that everyone would be required to accept. This council would be unlike anything Christianity had seen before. Previous church councils had been regional affairs, called by bishops to address local issues. This would be an ecumenical council, universal in scope, imperial in backing, and binding on all Christians everywhere. Constantine was about to transform Christianity from a religion into a state institution. The church was about to become the church. In the summer of 325 AD, hundreds of bishops converged on the city of Nicaea in Bithynia, summoned by imperial command. They came from every province, from Spain and Gaul in the west, from Egypt and Syria in the east, from the Balkans and Asia Minor. Some were old men bearing the scars of persecution, having survived torture and imprisonment under Diocletian. Others were young administrators who had known only the post-313 world where Christianity was legal and increasingly favoured. They spoke different languages, represented different theological traditions, and held widely varying opinions on the question they had been called to settle. Constantine paid for everything. He provided transportation for bishops who couldn't afford the journey. He arranged lodging, he supplied food. The bishops travelled and stayed at imperial expense, protected by imperial authority, gathering at emperor's command. This was unprecedented. Never before had the Roman state organised a meeting of Christian bishops. Never before had an emperor taken personal responsibility for resolving Christian theological disputes. The very existence of the council announced that Christianity had entered a new era. An era where church and state were becoming partners, where theological questions had political implications, and where the emperor could and would intervene in matters of faith. The council opened with a dramatic moment. Constantine himself entered the assembly hall. The bishops stood. The emperor took his seat, not as a distant authority sending instructions, but as a participant in the council itself. He addressed the assembly, speaking through an interpreter since he knew little Greek. He urged unity, warned against division, and made clear that he expected the bishops to reach consensus. This was extraordinary. Constantine was not a theologian. He had not been baptized. He was not even formally a member of the church. Yet here he was, presiding over a gathering that would define Christian orthodoxy for centuries to come. Some bishops welcomed this. They saw Constantine as God's instrument, a Christian emperor whose power could protect the church and spread the faith. If Constantine wanted to use his authority to help resolve theological disputes, that was divine providence at work. But others must have been uneasy. This was the same imperial power that had persecuted Christians for centuries. The same state machinery that had burned scriptures, destroyed churches, and executed bishops was now claiming the right to determine correct Christian belief. The emperor who still held the title of Pontifex Maximus of the pagan religion, who still appeared on coins with pagan imagery, who had never been baptized, this man was going to help decide the nature of Christ. The debate over Arius's teachings was intense. Arius himself was present, along with several bishops who supported his position. They argued their case using scripture and philosophical reasoning. Jesus was called the firstborn of creation in scripture. Jesus himself said, "The Father is greater than I." Jesus prayed to the Father, which implied distinction and subordination. How could the Father and Son be equal if Scripture itself showed the Son submitting to the Father? The majority of bishops rejected this reasoning. Led by Alexander of Alexandria, and a young deacon named Athanasius, they insisted that Christ must be fully divine, of the same essence as the Father, or else Christian worship was idolatry and salvation was impossible. They pointed to other scriptures. I and the Father are one. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. These passages required understanding Christ as fully divine, not as a created being. The debate went on for weeks, but Constantine made clear that he wanted resolution, not endless discussion. Pressure mounted on the bishops to reach agreement. Eventually the council produced a statement, the Nicene Creed. This creed declared that Jesus Christ was of one substance with the Father, explicitly rejecting Arius' position. The Son was not created. He was eternally begotten from the Father, true God from true God of the same divine essence. This was now official doctrine. Not just the opinion of some bishops, not just one theological school among many, but the authorized teaching of the universal church, backed by imperial authority. The council also made organizational decisions. It established a hierarchy among bishops, with the bishops of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch recognized as having special authority over their regions. It set a uniform date for celebrating Easter, ending disputes between Eastern and Western Christians over the calendar. It established procedures for ordaining clergy and dealing with schism. In short, the Council of Nicaea transformed Christianity from a network of semi-independent communities into a hierarchical institution with defined leadership, official doctrine, and state backing. Arius and the bishops who continued to support him were exiled. Constantine issued an imperial decree condemning Arianism as heresy. Arius's books were ordered burned. Anyone found possessing Arian writings could be executed. Theological dissent was now not just religiously wrong but legally criminal. This was the cost of imperial favour. Christianity had gained legal protection, financial support, and institutional power. In exchange, it had surrendered the freedom to disagree about fundamental questions. The emperor, not the community of believers, would determine what Christianity meant. Constantine was satisfied. He had forced unity on a divided church. The question of Christ's nature had been settled by council and confirmed by imperial decree. Now Christianity could serve its purpose as a unifying force for the empire. But the unity was superficial and temporary. Many bishops had signed the Nicene Creed only under pressure. Arian beliefs remained popular, especially in the eastern provinces. The theological questions were not actually resolved, just suppressed. Within a few years, the controversy would erupt again, even more violently. And there was another consequence, less immediately obvious, but ultimately more significant. The Council of Nicaea established a precedent. The emperor had the right and the duty to intervene in church affairs, to convene councils, to enforce doctrinal uniformity. Christianity was becoming an imperial project, and Constantine was its archivist. This meant that theological correctness was now determined not just by scripture, not just by tradition, not just by reasoned debate among believers, but by political power. The version of Christianity that aligned with imperial interests would be orthodoxy. Other versions would be heresy. And heresy was about to become very dangerous. The Council of Nicaea did not merely define correct belief. It created a mechanism for identifying and suppressing incorrect belief. This mechanism would become one of the most effective systems of ideological control in human history. The logic was straightforward. If there was one true Christianity, defined by the Nicene Creed and endorsed by the emperor, then any deviation from this standard was not just wrong but dangerous. Error could lead people away from salvation. False teaching could corrupt entire communities. For the good of souls, for the health of the church, for the stability of the empire, false teaching had to be identified and eliminated. This required several components, all of which Constantine's favour made possible. First, there had to be a clear standard of orthodoxy. The Nicene Creed provided this. Any teaching that contradicted the creed was, by definition, heretical. This eliminated the ambiguity that had previously existed, where different Christian communities could hold different theological opinions without one being obviously wrong. Now there was an official measure of correctness. Second, there had to be authority figures empowered to identify heresy. The bishops, organised in a clear hierarchy and backed by state recognition, filled this role. Bishops had the authority to examine teachings, judge whether they conformed to orthodoxy, and pronounce condemnation on those who taught error. And crucially, these judgments were now backed by secular law. A bishop's decree that someone was a heretic had legal consequences. Third, there had to be consequences for heresy. Before Constantine, being declared a heretic by other Christians meant social exclusion, perhaps being barred from communion, but nothing more serious. Now, heresy was a civil crime. Heretics could have their property confiscated. They could be exiled. Their books could be burned. In some cases, they could be executed. Fourth, there had to be a mechanism for suppressing heretical texts. This was crucial because Christianity, unlike many ancient religions, was a religion of the book. Christian identity was tied to specific texts, scriptures that told the story of Jesus, letters from apostles, accounts of the early church. If these texts contained conflicting messages, people could read them and form different understandings of Christianity. Orthodoxy required controlling which texts were considered authoritative and eliminating texts that taught contrary doctrines. Constantine provided the imperial power to make this possible. He could issue decrees ordering the destruction of heretical books. He could authorize searches of private homes to confiscate forbidden texts. He could impose penalties on anyone found copying or distributing banned materials. The Roman state's administrative apparatus, which had been used to persecute Christians, was now being used to enforce Christian orthodoxy. The targets were not just Arian writings. The Council of Nicaea and subsequent church councils addressed multiple theological controversies, and each controversy produced losers whose texts became targets for suppression. There were debates about the Trinity. Texts that described God in ways that contradicted Nicene orthodoxy had to be eliminated. There were debates about Christ's nature, texts that emphasized Jesus' humanity over his divinity, or vice versa, or that described the relationship between his divine and human natures in unapproved ways, became suspect. There were debates about salvation. Texts that suggested salvation could be achieved through knowledge or inner spiritual transformation, rather than through the Church's sacraments, threatened the institutional Church's authority. There were debates about Scripture itself. Dozens of Gospels, Acts, epistles, and apocalypses circulated among Christian communities. Some told stories not found in other Gospels, some attributed different sayings to Jesus. Some emphasized different aspects of his teaching. The Church had to decide which of these texts were genuinely apostolic and which were later inventions or heretical corruptions. This decision was not made through some neutral, scholarly process. It was made through a combination of tradition, theological judgment, and political power. Texts that had been read in mainstream churches for generations were accepted. Texts that were used primarily by groups now deemed heretical were rejected. Texts that taught doctrines contradicting Nicene orthodoxy were condemned. By the end of the 4th century, the Christian biblical canon had been essentially settled. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were in. The Acts of the Apostles was in. The letters of Paul were in. Other texts that had been used by some Christian communities, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Paul, were out. They were not just excluded from the official canon, they were actively suppressed. Constantine and his successors issued explicit orders for the destruction of heretical books. Imperial officials were authorized to search for and confiscate these texts. Monasteries and church libraries that possessed banned books were required to surrender them for burning. Individuals caught copying or distributing forbidden texts faced punishment. The effectiveness of this suppression is demonstrated by what survived. Of the dozens of early Christian texts that we know existed, because they are mentioned in surviving sources, most have completely disappeared. We have fragments, quotations in texts written to refute them, or mentions in lists of heretical books. But the books themselves were destroyed so thoroughly that until the 20th century, we had essentially no complete copies of most alternative early Christian literature. This was not accidental. This was systematic ideological purging, using state power to enforce religious uniformity. The bishops who cooperated with this suppression believed they were protecting truth. From their perspective, heretical texts were spiritually dangerous, leading people away from salvation toward damnation. Destroying these texts was an act of mercy, preventing souls from being corrupted by false teaching. But the result was that Christians lost access to the diversity of early Christian thought. The debates, the alternative interpretations, the different ways of understanding Jesus' message, all of this was buried. What survived was the version of Christianity that had allied itself with imperial power, that had organized itself hierarchically, that had made its peace with wealth and political authority. Constantine probably didn't fully grasp what he was doing. He wanted unity and was willing to use force to achieve it. He recognized that Christianity's value to the empire depended on Christians agreeing with each other, so he empowered church authorities to compel agreement. But the long-term consequence was that Christianity became something it had not been before, an enforcer of ideological conformity, willing to use violence to suppress dissent, allied with state power rather than standing apart from it. The martyrs had died rather than participate in Roman religious rituals. Now their spiritual descendants were using Roman power to punish Christians who believed differently. This transformation would become even more pronounced after Constantine's death, as later emperors continued and intensified the project of creating a unified Christian empire. But the template was established in Constantine's reign. Orthodoxy defined by councils, enforced by bishops, backed by imperial decrees, and defended through the destruction of alternative voices. The church had become an instrument of power, and that meant it would inevitably be used in ways that had nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed before the suppression began. Early Christianity was not a monolithic movement with a single agreed-upon set of beliefs and texts. It was a diverse collection of communities, each with its own traditions, its own leaders, its own texts, and its own understanding of what Jesus had taught and what his life meant. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of different texts circulated among Christian communities. These texts claim to record Jesus' teachings, describe his actions, explain his significance, and guide believers in living according to his message. They included Gospels attributed to various apostles, acts describing the adventures of different followers of Jesus, epistles offering theological instruction, and apocalypses revealing the future. Many of these texts are now lost completely, known only from references in other ancient writings, but enough has survived, particularly in the 20th century discoveries at Nag Hammadi and other sites, to give us a sense of just how diverse early Christianity was. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which parallel sayings in the canonical Gospels, but some of which are unique. Unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Thomas contains no narrative, no birth story, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection. It is simply a collection of Jesus' teachings, presented as secret wisdom revealed to his disciple Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas begins with a striking claim. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." This is a very different Christianity from what became orthodox. Salvation comes not through Jesus' death and resurrection, but through understanding his secret teachings. The emphasis is on knowledge, on inner spiritual insight, rather than on faith in Christ's sacrifice. Jesus is presented primarily as a wisdom teacher, revealing hidden truths that can liberate those who understand them. Some of the sayings in Thomas are familiar from the canonical Gospels. Love your brother as your own soul. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. But the overall emphasis is different. Where the canonical Gospels present Jesus as the unique Son of God whose death atones for human sin, Thomas presents Jesus as a revealer of wisdom, teaching that the divine is already present within each person and needs only to be recognized. The Gospel of Mary, likely written in the 2nd century, presents Mary Magdalene as one of Jesus' closest disciples, to whom he revealed teachings not given to the male apostles. In this text, Mary has a vision of the risen Jesus and shares teachings with the other disciples. Peter and Andrew are skeptical, questioning whether Jesus really spoke to Mary and taught her things he didn't teach them. Levi defends Mary, saying, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" This gospel presents a version of early Christianity where women had authority as teachers and visionaries, where spiritual insight was valued over institutional authority, and where Peter's role was not uniquely privileged. It's easy to see why this text would have been problematic for a church that was increasingly organized hierarchically, with an all-male clergy claiming authority descended from Peter. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 1970s and not published until 2006, presents an even more radical reinterpretation. In this text, Judas is not the villain who betrayed Jesus, but the hero who understood Jesus' mission better than the other disciples. Jesus tells Judas that he will sacrifice the man that clothes me. That is, Judas will help Jesus escape from his physical body. The other disciples are portrayed as misunderstanding Jesus' message, thinking he wants blood sacrifice when actually he wants spiritual liberation. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, emphasizes mystical union with the divine and includes cryptic references to ritual practices. It speaks of bridal chambers, of becoming no longer a Christian but a Christ, of the sacrament as mystery rather than memorial. It describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, whom he loved more than the other disciples and kissed on the mouth, causing the other disciples to be jealous. These texts represent versions of Christianity that understood Jesus' message in fundamentally different ways from what became orthodox. They emphasized knowledge over faith. Salvation came from understanding secret teachings, from gnosis, spiritual insight, rather than from believing in Christ's atoning death. Inner divinity over external authority. The divine was present within each person. Salvation was about recognizing and awakening this inner divinity, not about submitting to church authority or receiving sacraments from priests, equality over hierarchy. Several of these texts give women prominent roles and question the authority structures that were developing in mainstream Christianity, multiplicity over uniformity. These texts assume that Jesus taught different things to different people, that there were levels of understanding, that esoteric teachings existed alongside public ones. Transformation over a transaction. Salvation was not a legal transaction where Jesus' death paid the penalty for sin. It was a process of spiritual awakening, of becoming divine, of escaping the material world's limitations. From the perspective of the mainstream church that was developing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, these were not simply alternative interpretations. They were dangerous heresies that corrupted Jesus' message. The bishops who would later call these texts heretical saw in them several fatal problems. First, these texts undermined the authority of the church hierarchy. If salvation came through personal spiritual insight rather than through sacraments administered by ordained clergy, what was the Church's role? Why would anyone need bishops or priests if they could achieve salvation through their own inner knowledge? Second, these texts could not be controlled. Secret teachings, private revelations, hidden wisdom, these were inherently resistant to institutional oversight. The Church could define orthodox doctrine, excommunicate heretics, and burn banned books. But it couldn't prevent people from claiming to have received special insights or secret knowledge directly from the divine. Third, these texts fragmented Christian identity. If there were many different valid ways to understand Jesus, if different teachers could present radically different versions of his message, then Christianity would remain a diverse collection of competing schools rather than becoming a unified movement. Fourth, these texts were politically useless to Constantine. An emperor who wanted to use Christianity to unify his empire needed Christianity to have clear doctrines, institutional structures, and hierarchical authority. A mystical religion of inner transformation, with diverse texts teaching that salvation came through personal spiritual insight, could not serve imperial purposes. The Christianity that allied itself with Constantine was the Christianity that had been organizing itself hierarchically, that emphasized the authority of bishops, that understood salvation through the Church's sacraments, that presented Jesus' death as a cosmic transaction that changed humanity's legal status before God. This was a Christianity that could be institutionalized, that could be organized, that could make clear rules about who was in and who was out. The other Christianities, the ones that emphasize secret teachings, inner transformation, personal revelation, and spiritual equality, could not serve these purposes. They had to be eliminated. To understand why Constantine and the bishops allied with him worked to suppress alternative Christian texts, we need to think not just theologically but politically. What did these texts threaten? What kind of Christianity was compatible with imperial power, and what kind was not? Consider what Constantine needed from Christianity. He needed a religion that would unify diverse populations under a shared identity and set of beliefs. This required clear doctrines that everyone could be required to accept. Mystical texts teaching that truth was hidden and accessible only to spiritual elites wouldn't work for this purpose. Support hierarchical authority. Constantine needed bishops who could act as local representatives of both church and state, who could enforce orthodoxy and maintain social order. Texts teaching that spiritual authority came from inner enlightenment rather than institutional position would undermine this hierarchy, legitimize imperial power. Constantine needed Christianity to teach that worldly authority came from God, that the emperor ruled by divine mandate, that obedience to the state was a religious duty. Texts teaching that the material world was evil, that political power was spiritually meaningless, or that true Christians should separate themselves from worldly affairs were problematic. Emphasize sin, judgment, and the need for salvation through authorized channels. A religion teaching that people were fundamentally flawed and needed external salvation kept them dependent on the church, which in turn depended on the state. Texts teaching that people had inner divinity and could achieve salvation through their own spiritual development were less useful for social control. Now consider what many of these alternative texts actually taught. The Gospel of Thomas taught that the kingdom of God was not coming in some external future event, but was already present within and around people, if only they had eyes to see. Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." This is spiritually powerful but politically dangerous. If the kingdom is already here, if salvation is about inner recognition rather than external events, then Christianity loses its apocalyptic urgency. There's no need for institutional church structures to prepare people for the coming judgment. There's no need for sacraments dispensed by authorized clergy. Each person becomes their own authority in relation to the divine. The Secret Book of John, another Nag Hammadi text, presented a complex mythology in which the material world was created not by the true God, but by an ignorant demiurge, a lesser divine being who thought he was the supreme deity, but was actually trapped in ignorance. Humans contain a spark of the true divine trapped in material bodies, and salvation means recognizing this divine spark and escaping the material world created by the false god. This mythology directly contradicted the Genesis creation account that mainstream Christianity had inherited from Judaism. It suggested that the God described in the Hebrew Bible was not the true supreme deity but a deluded impostor. It portrayed the material world not as God's good creation but as a prison. And it suggested that enlightenment, not faith or obedience, was the path to salvation. For a church trying to present itself as the continuation of biblical Israel, for bishops claiming authority descended from the apostles, for an institutional religion that needed people to see the physical world as meaningful and political authority as divinely ordained, this was unacceptable. The Gospel of Mary and texts like it gave women prominent spiritual authority, presenting them as teachers, visionaries, and leaders. This contradicted the increasingly male-dominated hierarchy of the mainstream church, where women were being excluded from official leadership roles. By the 4th century, the church was actively arguing that women could not teach, could not hold authority over men, and certainly could not be ordained as priests or bishops. Texts presenting Mary Magdalene as one of Jesus' primary disciples, as the recipient of special teachings, as having spiritual authority that challenged Peter's authority. These texts couldn't be tolerated in a church where male bishops were consolidating power and claiming exclusive authority to interpret doctrine. The Apocryphon of James and similar texts emphasized the importance of suffering and martyrdom, but in a way that made political accommodation impossible. These texts taught that true Christians should expect persecution, that comfort and worldly success were spiritually dangerous, that the church should remain separate from power rather than allying with it. After Constantine, when Christianity was not just legal but favoured, when bishops were wealthy and influential, when churches were receiving state funding and building grand basilicas, these texts' insistence on poverty and separation from the world became embarrassing reminders of what Christianity had once claimed to be. The most dangerous element in many of these texts was their epistemology, their theory of how people gain spiritual knowledge. Orthodox Christianity increasingly taught that knowledge of God came through the church, through scripture as interpreted by bishops, through sacraments administered by priests, through doctrines defined by councils. Individual spiritual experience was subordinated to institutional authority. Many of the alternative texts taught the opposite. They insisted that true knowledge of God came through direct personal experience, through inner awakening, through mystical insight that couldn't be mediated by institutions. Some went further, suggesting that the institutional church, with its bishops and rituals and doctrines, was actually an obstacle to true spirituality, a structure built by people who misunderstood Jesus' message and wanted to control others. From Constantine's perspective, and from the perspective of the bishops who allied with him, these texts represented a Christianity that was ungovernable, because it denied institutional authority, divisive, because it encouraged individual interpretation rather than doctrinal uniformity. Politically useless, because it couldn't be harnessed to support state power. Socially dangerous, because it suggested that people didn't need the church. These texts had to be suppressed, not because they were false. Constantine probably didn't care about abstract theological truth, but because they represented versions of Christianity that couldn't serve imperial purposes. The Christianity that survived was the Christianity that could be made useful to power. It had clear doctrines that could be enforced. It had hierarchical structures that could be integrated with state administration. It had sacraments that kept people dependent on the institutional church. It had narratives about sin, judgment, and salvation that emphasized human inadequacy and the need for external authority. The Christianities that were suppressed were the ones that suggested people could find God without institutions, that spiritual authority came from inner experience rather than external ordination, that transformation was more important than obedience. What Constantine and his bishops created was not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret plot. It was simply the inevitable result of Christianity allying with imperial power. The versions of Christianity compatible with that alliance flourished. The versions incompatible with it were systematically eliminated. And because the suppression was so successful, most Christians for the next 1600 years would have no idea that these alternative versions had ever existed. The suppression of alternative Christian texts did not happen accidentally or gradually. It was deliberate, systematic, and backed by the full force of Roman law and military power. Constantine himself issued direct orders for the destruction of heretical writings. In a letter written around 3 AD, quoted by Eusebius, Constantine addressed the heretics directly. Understand now by this present statute Novatians, Valentinians, Marcionites, Paulians, and all who are called Cataphrygians, that your doctrines are vain and false. We have set down with plainness that which we wish everyone to believe. For the sake of all, then, we have ordered that you be deprived of all the places where you hold assemblies, so that your errors may meet with no opportunity for assembling. We have ordered, moreover, that all your meeting houses should be confiscated and handed over without delay to the Catholic Church, that the errors you spread may be left with no place in which to shelter. This was not a theological argument. This was a legal decree ordering the seizure of property from Christian groups deemed heretical. Constantine was using state power to destroy communities that had their own churches, their own traditions, their own texts, and their own understandings of Christianity. The letter continues, "As for the writings of such authors, we have thought fit to place them under the ban, so that the very memory of them may be wholly blotted out. If anyone shall be found to have hidden away such writings, and shall not immediately burn them, let him be aware that he shall suffer capital punishment." Capital punishment. For hiding books. This is extraordinary. Constantine was threatening to execute Christians, people who called themselves followers of Jesus, who read their own Gospels, who believed they were faithful to Christ's teaching, simply for possessing texts that contradicted the orthodoxy he was establishing. Later emperors intensified these policies. Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395, issued a series of edicts that made Christianity the official religion of the empire and outlawed all forms of paganism and Christian heresy. His Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD declared, "It is our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue in the profession of that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter. We authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians, but as for the others, since, in our judgment, they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics." Heretics were no longer simply mistaken. They were foolish madmen to be branded with an ignominious name. And branding was not merely rhetorical. Heretics lost legal rights. They could not hold public office or could not teach, could not assemble for worship. Their property could be confiscated. They could be exiled. In some cases, they could be executed. Theodosius issued further decrees specifying penalties for different heresies. Manichaeans, followers of a dualistic religion that had some Christian elements, could be executed. Donatists lost the right to assemble or hold property. Arians, despite having been numerous and influential, were systematically purged from positions of authority. One edict from 380 AD reads, "All places where heretics gather for worship, whether in houses or churches, shall be confiscated and turned over to the Catholic Church. Those who hold heretical services shall be punished with fines. Those who persist in their error shall be subject to exile or execution as the case may require." The machinery of Roman law, which had been refined over centuries to govern an empire, was now being used to enforce Christian orthodoxy. Imperial officials who had once hunted Christians were now hunting the wrong kind of Christians. The destruction of texts was systematic. Libraries were searched. Monasteries were inspected. Private homes were raided. When forbidden books were found, they were burned publicly. A symbolic destruction meant to demonstrate that these texts had no legitimate place in Christian society. We can track the disappearance of alternative Christian literature through references in surviving texts. Epiphanius, a 4th century bishop who appointed himself a heresy hunter, wrote a book called Panarion, the Medicine Chest, cataloguing 80 different heresies. For many of these heresies, he quotes from their sacred texts, often disparagingly, sometimes mockingly, but he quotes them. This allows us to reconstruct fragments of text that were otherwise completely destroyed. But Epiphanius' work also shows us the mindset of the destroyers. These texts weren't just wrong, they were poisonous, dangerous, requiring a medicine chest to counteract their effects. They needed to be not just refuted but eliminated, so that innocent Christians wouldn't be contaminated by exposure to them. Augustine, perhaps the most influential church father of the Western Church, argued explicitly for the use of state power to suppress heresy. Earlier in his career, he had opposed coercing religious belief, but after dealing with the Donatist schism in North Africa, he changed his mind. In his later writings, he argued that using force to compel heretics to return to Orthodox Christianity was an act of love, like a father disciplining a wayward child. The state's violence was mercy, preventing heretics from damning themselves through false belief. This theology of forced orthodoxy would dominate Christian thinking for more than 1,000 years, justifying inquisitions, crusades, and religious wars. But it originated in this period when Christianity allied itself with imperial power and began using that power to eliminate competition. The effectiveness of the suppression is evident in what didn't survive. Of the many Gospels that circulated in early Christianity, only 4 were included in the official canon. Of the dozens of Acts describing the adventures of various apostles, only Acts describing Peter and Paul was canonized. Numerous epistles were excluded. Alternative apocalypses were banned. For some of these excluded texts, we have fragment or quotations preserved by their critics. For others, we have only titles mentioned in ancient lists. For still others, we have nothing at all. We know they must have existed because later authors refer to them, but no trace remains. The texts that did survive did so through extraordinary circumstances. Some were hidden in sealed jars and buried in the Egyptian desert, only to be discovered by accident in the 20th century. Some survived as quotations in works written to refute them. Some were translated into languages spoken in regions beyond the Roman Empire's reach, where the suppression couldn't be fully enforced. But the vast majority were simply destroyed, burned by imperial officials, confiscated and pulped by church authorities, lost when their owners, fearing prosecution, destroyed them rather than risk execution. What survived was what Constantine and his bishops wanted to survive: texts that supported hierarchical church structure, that emphasized sin and the need for redemption through authorized channels, that presented Christianity as compatible with wealth and power that could be organized into a clear, enforceable orthodoxy. What was lost was the diversity, the debate, the alternative visions of what Christianity might have been. The mystical Christianities, the egalitarian Christianities, the Christianities that saw the divine within rather than only above. the Christianities that questioned authority rather than supporting it. These were buried so thoroughly that for 16 centuries most Christians didn't know they had ever existed. When we speak of Constantine's Christianity, we need to remember this suppression. The Christianity that became orthodox, that spread throughout Europe, that shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia, was not the only Christianity available. It was the Christianity that was useful to an emperor. The other Christianities were destroyed by law, by force, by imperial command. And for Constantine, this was not a tragedy. It was exactly what he had intended. Christianity was unified because dissenting voices had been silenced. The church supported imperial authority because Christians who questioned that authority had been eliminated. Orthodoxy reigned because heterodoxy had been criminalized. Constantine had successfully weaponized faith. The question was whether faith could survive what he had done to it. Throughout his reign, Constantine occupied a peculiar position relative to Christianity. He built churches, he funded bishops, and he convened councils. He issued decrees defining and enforcing Christian orthodoxy. He claimed that the Christian God had granted him victory and guided his rule. He presented himself as the defender of the faith and the protector of the church, but he was not baptized. Baptism was the initiation rite into Christianity, the moment when a person formally became a Christian, when their sins were washed away, when they entered into the community of believers. For a religion that emphasized the necessity of baptism for salvation, Constantine's unbaptized status throughout most of his life was anomalous. Why did Constantine delay? The traditional explanation, offered by Eusebius and other Christian writers, is that Constantine believed baptism washed away all sins committed before the baptism, but offered no guaranteed protection against sins committed after. By delaying baptism until he was near death, Constantine could ensure that he died in a state of grace, with all his sins forgiven and no opportunity to accumulate new ones. This explanation makes Constantine sound spiritually cautious, perhaps even pious in his own way. But it also reveals something troubling. Constantine apparently expected to continue sinning throughout his life, and wanted a way to escape the consequences. And indeed, Constantine's reign was marked by actions that sat uneasily with Christian ethics. He executed his own son Crispus in 326 AD. The exact circumstances remain mysterious, but it was clearly a political killing. Shortly after, he also ordered the execution of his wife Fausta. These were not the only executions Constantine ordered. Maintaining power in the late Roman Empire required ruthlessness, and Constantine demonstrated that ruthlessness repeatedly. So here was the defender of Christianity, the man who claimed divine favour, the emperor who called church councils and enforced orthodoxy, deliberately remaining outside the Christian community so that he could continue to exercise power without the moral constraints that baptism might theoretically impose. This suggests a deeply transactional understanding of Christianity. Baptism was useful, but only at the right time. Faith was important, but it shouldn't interfere with political necessity. The Christian God was powerful, but Constantine would maintain his autonomy as long as possible. There's another possible explanation for Constantine's delay, one that is less flattering, but perhaps more honest. Constantine was never entirely convinced. Consider his religious practice throughout his reign. He continued to use the title Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman pagan religion, until his death. He continued to appear on coins with solar imagery well into the 320s. He continued to participate in traditional Roman ceremonies. When he built his new capital, Constantinople, he included both Christian churches and pagan temples. He allowed pagan worship to continue throughout the empire, never issuing an empire-wide ban on pagan sacrifice or temple worship. Constantine acted like a man hedging his bets. He favoured Christianity, but he didn't fully commit to it. He promoted Christian clergy, but he didn't alienate pagan constituencies. He claimed the Christian God's favour, but he didn't burn the bridges to the traditional gods. This makes sense for a politician. Constantine had seen religious violence tear communities apart. He had witnessed the failure of persecution to eliminate Christianity. He understood that religious transformation would take generations and that trying to force it too quickly would provoke resistance. But it's harder to square with the image of Constantine as a genuine convert who experienced a miraculous divine intervention. A man who truly believed that the Christian God had personally appeared to him and granted him victory might be expected to fully embrace that God's religion, submit to its requirements, and model Christian behavior for his subjects. Constantine did none of these things. He maintained distance. He retained autonomy. He kept his options open. Only in 387, when he was dying, did Constantine finally request baptism. Eusebius, who was present, describes the scene in glowing terms. Constantine called for bishops, confessed his sins, and received baptism while dressed in white robes, symbolizing his purification. According to Eusebius, Constantine then declared that he had hoped to be baptized in the Jordan River, where Jesus himself was baptized but would accept God's will in being baptized wherever divine providence had placed him. He died shortly after, secure in his salvation. This deathbed baptism became the model for Christian emperors and nobility for generations. Many delayed baptism into adulthood, or even until near death, wanting to ensure they died in a state of grace. The Church eventually had to discourage this practice, insisting that Christians should be baptized as infants or young children rather than waiting until the last moment. But Constantine's delay raises a fundamental question about his relationship with Christianity. Was he a believer who strategically maintained political flexibility, or was he a politician who used religious language strategically and only submitted to baptism when death made continued autonomy impossible? The answer probably contains elements of both. Constantine likely believed in some sense in the Christian God's power. The vision before the Milvian Bridge, whatever its nature, seems to have genuinely impressed him. His consistent attribution of military success to divine favor suggests real conviction. His willingness to intervene in theological disputes indicates he thought doctrine mattered. But Constantine also understood Christianity primarily as a tool for imperial unity and social control. His Christianity was about power, divine power, legitimizing political power, religious authority supporting secular authority, church structures reinforcing state structures. Personal salvation, moral transformation, spiritual growth, these seem to have been secondary concerns at best. Constantine died in May shortly after his baptism, having ruled for over 30 years. He left behind an empire that was in the process of becoming Christian, a church that was inseparably intertwined with state power, and a precedent for imperial involvement in religious affairs that would shape Christian history for over 1,000 years. But he also left unresolved tensions that would explode in the centuries after his death. If the emperor could define orthodoxy, what happened when emperors disagreed about doctrine? If the church depended on state support, what happened when the state used that dependency to control the church? If Christianity was useful for maintaining social order, what happened to Christians who believed faith should challenge rather than support the existing order? These questions would haunt Christianity for centuries, but they all flowed from decisions Constantine made, decisions about how to use religion, how to deploy divine legitimacy, how to transform a persecuted sect into an imperial institution. Constantine died a baptized Christian, but the Christianity he left behind was one that he had fundamentally transformed. Whether that transformation was faithful to Jesus' message or a betrayal of it remains one of history's most consequential debates. By the time of Constantine's death, Christianity had undergone a transformation so complete that it would have been almost unrecognizable to the martyrs who had died under Diocletian just 30 years earlier. Christianity had become wealthy. Churches owned vast properties. Bishops lived in palaces. The church employed thousands of clergy, supported by tax exemptions and direct state subsidies. Christian basilicas competed with pagan temples in architectural grandeur. The religion that had once prided itself on meeting in homes and catacombs now constructed monumental buildings designed to awe and impress. Constantine had funded this transformation personally. He donated imperial properties to the church. He directed tax revenues to support church operations. He paid for the construction of major basilicas, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built on the site believed to be Jesus' tomb. These were not modest structures. They were statements of power, demonstrations that Christianity now had the wealth and authority to shape the urban landscape. The bishops themselves had become powerful political figures. They had legal authority to adjudicate certain disputes, with their judgments backed by secular courts. They had direct access to imperial officials. They received appeals from across their regions on matters both spiritual and administrative. In many cities, the bishop became one of the most influential people in local governance. This created a new incentive structure. Becoming a bishop was no longer primarily a spiritual calling. It was also a path to power, wealth, and influence. Men who might once have sought careers in imperial administration now sought positions in the church hierarchy. The qualities that made someone a successful ecclesiastical politician, the ability to build alliances, manage complex institutions, negotiate with secular authorities, became as important as theological learning or spiritual devotion. The church also developed sophisticated administrative structures. Dioceses were organized hierarchically, with bishops reporting to archbishops who reported to patriarchs. Councils met regularly to coordinate policy and adjudicate disputes. Written correspondence flowed constantly between churches in different regions. The church was becoming a parallel government, with its own hierarchy, its own legal system, its own revenue streams, and its own sphere of authority. Constantine had encouraged this development. He wanted Christianity to be organized, disciplined, and hierarchical because such a structure could be integrated with imperial administration. Bishops could serve as local representatives of imperial authority. Church networks could disseminate imperial propaganda. Christian loyalty could reinforce political loyalty. But this integration came with costs. The church was losing its capacity to speak prophetically against power because it was becoming part of power. Bishops who owed their positions and resources to imperial favour were unlikely to challenge imperial policy. Church leaders who lived in wealth were unlikely to challenge economic inequality. An institution intertwined with the state was unlikely to question state violence. This represents a fundamental shift in Christianity's social position. The early church had existed at the margins of society, offering an alternative vision to mainstream Roman values. Christians had practiced economic sharing, questioned military violence, and maintained suspicion of wealth and power. The martyrs had died specifically because they refused to participate in the religious legitimation of imperial authority. Now Christianity was providing that legitimation. Bishops blessed emperors. Priests prayed for military victories. Church ceremonies incorporated imperial imagery. The religion that had once insisted that its kingdom was not of this world was becoming deeply invested in the kingdoms of this world. Some Christians resisted this transformation. The monastic movement, which began in the deserts of Egypt in the late 3rd century, represented in part a protest against the church's accommodation with power. Christians who were serious about spiritual transformation fled to the wilderness, seeking to maintain the ascetic discipline and separation from the world that had characterized early Christianity. But monasticism, while it preserved certain spiritual practices, also became institutionalized and eventually integrated into the church hierarchy. Monasteries received imperial endowments. Famous monks were pressed into service as bishops. Even the protest movement was absorbed into the system. By the mid-4th century, being Christian was becoming normal, even advantageous. Imperial officials were expected to be Christian. Advancement in government service increasingly required baptism. The wealthy built churches to display their status. What had once been a mark of opposition to the social order became a marker of belonging to it. This normalization changed what Christianity meant in practice. For the martyrs, being Christian had meant being willing to die rather than compromise with the empire. For Christians under Constantine and his successors, being Christian meant participating in empire, supporting its authority, accepting its violence as necessary for maintaining order. The Church developed sophisticated arguments for why this was acceptable, even necessary. Christians had a duty to maintain social order. The empire, now Christian, was providentially ordained by God. Military service was a legitimate calling. Wealth was acceptable as long as it was used charitably. The state's violence against heretics and criminals was justice, not oppression. All of these arguments served to make Christianity compatible with power, and that compatibility was exactly what Constantine had sought. Constantine understood that Christianity's value to the empire depended on its ability to support rather than challenge imperial authority. A Christianity that insisted on pacifism would be useless for defending borders. Christianity that rejected wealth would alienate the aristocracy. Christianity that maintained separation from political power would not unify the empire. So the Christianity that Constantine promoted, through patronage, through legal privilege, through theological councils, was a Christianity that could serve imperial purposes. This Christianity preached obedience to authority, not questioning of it. It emphasized sin and redemption, keeping people focused on personal salvation rather than social transformation. It developed elaborate hierarchies that mirrored and reinforced secular hierarchies. It taught that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, making current injustice more bearable. This was not a conspiracy. No one sat down and consciously decided to corrupt Christianity, but the cumulative effect of hundreds of decisions about which bishops to favour, which theological positions to enforce, which texts to preserve, which practices to encourage, was to transform Christianity into something that supported rather than challenged the structures of power. By the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official religion of the empire, and paganism was outlawed. This completed the transformation. Christianity had gone from persecuted sect to official ideology in less than a century. The religion that had begun with a crucified criminal was now the voice of the most powerful state on earth. The machinery was complete. Christianity provided religious legitimation for imperial authority. The empire provided military protection and financial support for the church. Bishops and emperors worked together to maintain order, suppress dissent, and enforce orthodoxy. Theological correctness and political loyalty became intertwined. This machinery would dominate European history for more than 1,000 years. The medieval synthesis of church and state, the divine right of kings, the idea of Christendom as a unified civilization, all of this flowed from the Constantinian transformation. But it also meant that Christianity had lost something essential. The prophetic voice that challenged power had been muted. The community of equals that shared resources had become a hierarchy that hoarded wealth. The movement that had refused to participate in violence was now blessing wars and burning heretics. Constantine had succeeded in using Christianity to serve imperial unity, but the cost was steep. Christianity had gained the world, and in the process, it had lost its soul. The transformation of Christianity from persecuted minority to imperial religion had one particularly bitter consequence. Christians began persecuting Christians. This was not an accidental byproduct of the Constantinian settlement. It was built into the logic of state-sponsored orthodoxy. Once the empire determined that there was one correct form of Christianity and that this orthodoxy was essential for political unity and social order, anyone teaching different doctrines became a threat not just to souls but to the state itself. Heresy became treason. The first victims were the Donatists in North Africa. The Donatist controversy had begun during the persecution under Diocletian. Some Christian clergy had handed over scriptures to imperial authorities rather than face martyrdom. After the persecution ended, rigorous Christians argued that these collaborators, called progso traitors, had forfeited their spiritual authority. Sacraments performed by traitor clergy were invalid. The Church needed to be purified of those who had compromised with persecutors. The mainstream Church disagreed. It argued that the validity of sacraments did not depend on the moral worthiness of the clergy performing them. Otherwise, Christians could never be sure if their baptism or communion was effective, since they couldn't know all the secret sins of their priests. Orthodoxy held that sacraments worked ex opere operato, by the very fact of being performed correctly by ordained clergy, not because of the personal holiness of the officiant. This theological debate became a schism. By Constantine's time, there were two parallel church hierarchies in North Africa, the mainstream Catholic Church and the Donatist Church, each claiming to be the true successor to the apostles. Constantine sided with the mainstream Church. He recognized the Catholic bishops, gave them state funds and property, and treated the Donatists as schismatics. The Donatists appealed to Constantine, asking him to adjudicate the dispute. Constantine convened councils to hear both sides, but when the councils ruled against the Donatists, Constantine enforced these decisions with imperial power. Donatist churches were confiscated, Donatist clergy were exiled, Donatist assemblies were banned. When Donatists resisted, military force was used. Christians who had survived Diocletian's persecution now faced persecution from a Christian emperor for being the wrong kind of Christian. The Donatists were shocked. How could the Church, which had suffered so much from state violence, now employ state violence against fellow Christians? How could bishops who claimed to follow Jesus endorse the empire's swords and whips to enforce theological conformity? The Catholic bishops had an answer. The Donatists were dividing the Church. They were creating scandal. They were leading souls astray. Force was necessary to protect the innocent from heretical teaching. The state's violence was medicine for sick souls, discipline for wayward children. This logic would be repeated throughout Christian history, justifying inquisitions and crusades and religious wars. But it originated here, in the generation after Constantine, when Christians first had to justify using power against other Christians. The Arian controversy followed a similar pattern, but on a larger scale. Despite the Council of Nicaea, Arianism remained popular, especially in the eastern provinces. Many bishops who had signed the Nicene Creed under pressure reverted to Arian views. Others who had not attended the council continued teaching Arian doctrine. For decades after Nicaea, the empire was convulsed by the Arian controversy. Bishops excommunicated each other. Councils condemned rival councils. Emperors intervened, some favouring Nicene orthodoxy, others favouring Arian views. At one point, the Emperor Constantius III, Constantine's son, imposed Arianism as official doctrine and exiled Nicene bishops. The result was theological chaos and real human suffering. Bishops were exiled, sent to distant provinces, separated from their congregations, sometimes dying in harsh conditions. Church property was confiscated and transferred to rival factions. Congregations were forced to accept clergy they considered heretics. Riots broke out in cities where theological factions fought for control of churches. Christians were suffering for their faith, but now the suffering was inflicted by other Christians using state power to enforce their theological positions. This was radically different from the persecutions under Diocletian. Those earlier persecutions had been about forcing Christians to renounce Christ and acknowledge the Roman gods. Christians understood what was being demanded and could refuse with clarity. The choice was stark: Christ or Caesar. But the new persecutions were about minute theological distinctions. Is Christ of the same substance as the Father, or of similar substance? One letter's difference in Greek, homoousios versus homoousios, became the distinction between orthodoxy and heresy, between state favour and state punishment. Christians who genuinely loved Jesus, who prayed faithfully, who lived moral lives, who served their communities, these people were being exiled, imprisoned, or worse, because they used the wrong theological formula to describe Christ's nature. And both sides believed they were defending essential truth. Both sides thought their opponents were teaching heresy that endangered souls. Both sides saw imperial enforcement of their position as necessary for the Church's purity. The human cost was immense. Families were divided, communities were torn apart, violence erupted, and all of it was done in the name of maintaining the true faith. As the 4th century progressed, the categories of heresy expanded. It wasn't just Arians and Donatists anymore. Priscillianists, Apollinarians, Nestorians, Eutychians, each new theological controversy produced new heresies, new condemnations, new persecutions. Some of these controversies involved genuine theological issues, but many were entangled with politics, regional rivalries, and personality conflicts between bishops. Condemning someone as a heretic became a way to destroy political opponents. Accusations of heresy were weapons in ecclesiastical power. Struggles. The machinery Constantine had created, councils defining doctrine, bishops enforcing it, emperors backing them with state power, became a tool for factional combat. And ordinary Christians trying to follow Jesus faithfully found themselves caught in these conflicts, pressured to affirm statements they didn't understand, forced to choose between bishops neither of whom they trusted. This was the human cost of the official truth. Certainty was purchased through coercion. Unity was manufactured through exclusion. Orthodoxy was maintained through persecution. And the victims were not pagans or outsiders, but fellow Christians who simply understood their faith differently. The martyr stories of the early church had been about Christians maintaining faith against hostile power. Now Christians were wielding hostile power against each other. The persecutors and the persecuted were both Christians, both claiming to serve Christ, both convinced they were defending truth. This is what Constantine's settlement had created. A Christianity where being wrong about doctrine could cost you everything, where theological error was criminal, where the state's violence was deployed in service of religious uniformity. And perhaps most tragically, Christians learned to see this as normal. The post-Constantinian church grew up thinking that this was how Christianity worked. The state enforced orthodoxy, heretics were suppressed, unity was maintained through power. Generations of Christians never knew anything different. By the end of the 4th century, Christians persecuting Christians was an established pattern that would continue for more than 1,000 years. The Inquisition of the medieval period, the religious wars of the Reformation era, the countless smaller acts of religious coercion, all of this was seeded in the Constantinian moment when Christianity gained state power and decided that wrong belief was a crime deserving punishment. The martyrs had died for the right to worship freely. Their descendants used state power to prevent others from worshipping freely. The persecuted had become persecutors, and they justified it using the same language of protecting truth, maintaining purity, and defending the faith. Constantine had given Christianity power, and Christians had used that power to betray their own foundational principles. For 16 centuries, the diversity of early Christianity remained buried. The alternative gospels, the mystical texts, the writings that questioned hierarchy and emphasized inner divinity, All of this was successfully suppressed. Most Christians never knew these texts had existed. What survived was what the institutional church had preserved: the 4 canonical Gospels, the approved epistles, the Acts of the Apostles, the single authorized revelation. These texts became the Bible, the definitive, complete record of Christian origins. The texts that had been excluded were not just forgotten, they were erased from Christian consciousness. Medieval Christianity had no idea that dozens of other Gospels had once circulated. The Catholic and later Protestant churches taught that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were the only Gospels ever written by Jesus' followers, that Paul's letters were the definitive interpretation of Jesus' message, that the biblical canon had been obvious from the beginning. This ignorance was not accidental. It was the intended result of the suppression campaign. Constantine and his bishops had not just wanted to defeat their theological opponents, they wanted to make it impossible for future generations to know that alternatives had ever existed, and they nearly succeeded. A few traces survived in the writings of heresy hunters like Irenaeus, Tertullian and Epiphanius, who quoted from texts they were condemning. Scholars could piece together fragments, glimpses of what the suppressed traditions had taught, but without complete texts, without full context, these fragments were curiosities, interesting for specialists but irrelevant to mainstream Christian understanding. The Church's official history presented a narrative of linear development. Jesus taught the apostles taught their disciples, the disciples established churches, and these churches maintained the pure apostolic tradition until it was codified in the canonical scriptures. Heresies were presented as later corruptions, innovations by people who misunderstood or deliberately distorted the original message. This narrative justified Orthodox Christianity's exclusive claims. If orthodoxy was simply the preservation of what Jesus and the apostles had always taught, then all other versions were counterfeit. The mainstream church was defending truth. Everyone else was spreading error. But this narrative was a simplification that erased the messy reality of early Christian diversity. Christianity had never been unified. From the earliest days, different communities understood Jesus' message differently, emphasized different aspects of his teaching, and developed different practices and structures. The orthodoxy that emerged victorious in the 4th century was not the original teaching preserved intact. It was one school of thought among many, the school that had organized most effectively, allied with political power, and suppressed its rivals. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Reformation era, this remained hidden. Catholics and Protestants fought over how to interpret the canonical scriptures, over church authority, over salvation and sacraments. But both sides accepted the same basic narrative about Christian origins and the same canonical texts. When Protestants rejected papal authority and insisted on scripture alone, they meant the scriptures that had been canonized in the 4th century. When they condemned Catholic innovations, they were trying to return to what they imagined was original Christianity. But they had no access to the texts that would have shown them how diverse original Christianity actually was. The Enlightenment brought new tools of historical criticism. Scholars began studying the Bible as a historical document, noticing contradictions, identifying different sources, questioning traditional authorship claims. This was controversial and threatening to religious authorities, but it was still working within the framework of the canonical texts. The alternative texts remained buried, literal, in the deserts of Egypt, in sealed jars hidden in caves, in the dry sands that preserved organic materials for millennia. The banned books lay waiting. Christians who had refused to surrender their sacred texts to imperial destruction had hidden them. Some died before they could retrieve them. Others were unable to return. The hiding places were forgotten. For 16 centuries, these texts lay silent while Christianity developed without them. While Christians imagined that the story they had been told was complete, while the church's power and the empire's sword successfully maintained the illusion that there had only ever been one true Christianity. But the books were waiting, and eventually by accident, by the random chance of a farmer digging in the wrong place or a shepherd exploring a cave, the silence would be broken, the ghosts would speak again, and when they did, they would force a reckoning with what Christianity had been, what it had become, and what had been lost in the transformation. In December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi, about 300 miles south of Cairo. He struck something hard with his mattock, a large sealed jar buried in the sand. He hesitated before breaking it open, fearing it might contain a jinn, an evil spirit. But the possibility of gold overcame his caution. Inside was not gold but books, 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, their pages filled with text in Coptic, the late Egyptian language that used Greek letters. Muhammad Ali initially saw them as worthless and gave some pages to his mother, who burned them to heat her oven. But he also showed some pages to a local priest who recognized that these might be valuable antiquities. What Muhammad Ali had discovered was one of the most significant archaeological finds in Christian history. These were not just ancient books, they were texts that had been banned, hidden, and successfully suppressed for 16 centuries. They were the voices that Constantine and his bishops had tried to silence forever. The discovery site was near an ancient monastery. Scholars believe that sometime in the 4th century, when imperial edicts ordered the destruction of heretical texts, monks at this monastery chose to hide their forbidden books rather than burn them. They sealed the codices in a jar and buried them in the desert, either hoping to retrieve them later when the persecution ended, or simply refusing to destroy texts they considered sacred. The monks never came back. Perhaps they were discovered and punished. Perhaps they died before they could retrieve the books. Perhaps they decided it was too dangerous. Whatever the reason, the texts remained buried until 1945, surviving 2 world wars, the rise and fall of empires, the entire history of medieval and modern Christianity. The codices eventually made their way to antiquities dealers and then to scholars. The process was chaotic. Texts were scattered, some were damaged, there was conflict over ownership and access, but gradually the contents became known. The Nag Hammadi library contained 52 texts. Some were previously unknown. Others were texts that scholars had known about only from references in ancient heresy hunters' writings, but had never read in full. Together, they provided an unprecedented window into the diversity of early Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas was there, 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, emphasizing knowledge and inner awakening. The Gospel of Philip, with its mystical theology and cryptic references to sacraments. The Gospel of Truth, a meditation on knowledge and ignorance, light and darkness. The Apocryphon of John, with its complex mythology of creation and redemption. The Gospel of Mary, presenting Mary Magdalene as a visionary and teacher. These were the texts that Constantine had ordered destroyed. These were the voices that the Orthodox Church had worked for centuries to silence, and now, by accident, they had returned. The initial scholarly response focused on categorizing and translating the texts. They were labeled Gnostic, a term referring to various forms of early Christianity that emphasized gnosis, or knowledge, as the path to salvation. This was controversial because Gnosticism had been condemned as heresy by the early Church Fathers, and some modern Christians were uncomfortable with texts that seemed to validate what had been labelled as error. But as scholars studied the text more carefully, it became clear that Gnostic was too narrow a category. These texts represented diverse forms of early Christianity, not all of which fit neatly into the category of Gnosticism as defined by ancient heresy hunters. What they revealed was not a single alternative form of Christianity, but a spectrum of different Christian movements, each with its own understanding of Jesus' message. Some emphasized mystical experience, some focused on inner transformation, Some questioned the Hebrew Bible's creator God. Some gave women prominent roles. Some rejected hierarchy. Some saw the material world as evil, while others simply saw it as less important than the spiritual realm. The texts challenged the orthodox narrative of Christian origins. They showed that early Christianity was far more diverse than the traditional story acknowledged. They demonstrated that the canonical Gospels were not the only Gospels, that alternative understandings of Jesus had existed from very early on, that the heresies condemned by the Church Fathers were not later corruptions, but were present from the beginning. This was deeply unsettling for traditional Christianity. If these texts were authentic products of early Christian communities, if they represented legitimate ways of understanding Jesus' message, then the Orthodox claim to exclusive possession of original Christianity was questionable. Maybe orthodoxy was just one option among many, the option that happened to win because it allied with political power. Conservative Christians responded by dismissing the Nag Hammadi texts as later inventions, claiming they couldn't possibly reflect authentic apostolic teaching. But dating studies and textual analysis suggested that many of these texts were as old as, or older than, some canonical New Testament writings. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, might preserve some sayings of Jesus that are older than their versions in the canonical Gospels. The Nag Hammadi discovery sparked decades of scholarly debate and popular fascination. Books like the Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels brought these texts to popular attention, arguing that they revealed a suppressed Christianity that was more mystical, more egalitarian, and less authoritarian than what became orthodox. Critics argued that this was romanticizing ancient heretics, projecting modern values onto ancient texts, and ignoring the real theological problems that had led the early church to reject these teachings. The texts weren't suppressed because of patriarchal power grabs, they were suppressed because they taught error. But whatever one's theological judgment, the historical fact remained. These texts existed, they were used by Christian communities, they were considered sacred by people who believed they followed Jesus, and they were systematically suppressed by the alliance of church and empire that Constantine had forged. The Nag Hammadi library showed what had been lost. It revealed the diversity that had been buried. It gave voice to Christians who'd been silenced. And it raised uncomfortable questions about whether the Christianity that had dominated Western history was the only possible Christianity, or simply the one that had been most useful to power. The farmer who found the texts didn't know any of this. He was just looking for fertilizer. But he had accidentally resurrected ghosts that would haunt Christianity for generations to come. We return to the question that has haunted this entire story. Did Constantine save Christianity, or did he transform it beyond recognition? The case for Constantine as saviour is straightforward. Christianity was a persecuted minority, illegal, subject to periodic attempts at complete elimination. Diocletian's great persecution had been the most systematic attempt yet to destroy the religion. If Constantine had not intervened, if Christianity had remained illegal, if the persecutions had continued, the religion might have been eliminated or reduced to a small, powerless sect. Constantine gave Christianity legal protection, then active support, then eventually dominance. He protected Christians from persecution. He built churches. He funded clergy. He convened councils to address theological disputes. He integrated Christianity into the empire's institutional structure. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity was the official religion of Rome, poised to become the dominant force in European civilization for the next 1,000 years. Without Constantine, Christianity might have vanished. With Constantine, it conquered the world. This narrative has been taught in churches for centuries. Constantine is Saint Constantine, equal to the apostles, the Christian emperor who fulfilled God's plan for spreading the gospel throughout the world. The story of his vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is presented as miraculous divine intervention. His reign is seen as providential. the moment when God gave Christianity worldly power so it could accomplish its mission. But there is another narrative, darker and more troubling. Constantine needed Christianity to unify his empire. He recognized that the religion had something valuable: organizational coherence, ideological unity, networks that crossed regional boundaries. He could use this, so he used it. He did not primarily convert Christianity to himself. He converted Christianity to his purposes. He made it useful. He made it compatible with wealth and power. He made it hierarchical and authoritarian. He made it intolerant of dissent. He made it into a tool of empire. The Christianity that emerged from Constantine's reign was fundamentally different from what had existed before. It was wealthy instead of poor. It was aligned with power instead of opposed to it. It was hierarchical instead of egalitarian. It was coercive instead of voluntary. It was orthodox instead of diverse. Was this inevitable? Could Christianity have survived without Constantine's intervention? We cannot know, but we can observe what was lost in the transformation. Christianity lost its prophetic voice. The religion that had challenged Roman values, that had insisted God's kingdom was not of this world, that had questioned wealth and power, this Christianity was replaced by a religion that legitimized empire, blessed military conquest, and became comfortable with wealth and authority. Christianity lost its diversity. The multiple ways of understanding Jesus, the different theological schools, the various forms of practice and community, all of this was flattened into orthodoxy. The mystical Christianities, the egalitarian Christianities, the Christianities that saw divinity within rather than only above, these were suppressed. Christianity lost its voluntarism. The religion that had spread through persuasion and personal commitment became enforceable by law. Heresy became crime. Theological error became punishable. Faith became compulsory. Christianity lost its moral clarity. The martyrs had known who they were and what they stood for. They refused to participate in violence, refused to acknowledge false gods, refused to compromise with unjust power. Their descendants used violence to enforce their gods' claims, participated enthusiastically in imperial warfare, and allied with the power structures they had once opposed. Were these losses necessary? Did Christianity have to become this to survive? Or did Constantine bend Christianity to his throne, reshaping it into something useful for an emperor, but distant from what Jesus had actually taught? The answer matters because it shapes how we understand Christianity's relationship with power today. If Constantine saved Christianity, then the alliance of faith and power is providential, even necessary. Churches should seek political influence. Christianity should be defended by law. Orthodoxy should be enforced. The powerful should be Christian, and Christians should be powerful. But if Constantine co-opted Christianity, if he transformed a religion of the powerless into an ideology of empire, then the Constantinian settlement was a betrayal. Faith should maintain distance from power. Churches should challenge rather than support authority. Diversity should be valued over uniformity. The Christianity that allies with empire has forgotten what it means to follow a crucified criminal. History suggests both narratives contain truth. Constantine did save Christianity from probable elimination, and he did transform it beyond recognition. These are not contradictory. They are two aspects of the same historical process. Christianity survived because Constantine protected it. But the Christianity that survived was one that Constantine shaped, not entirely, not exclusively, but profoundly. He gave it institutional structures. He integrated it with state power. He made it orthodox by suppressing alternatives. He made it useful by eliminating the elements that challenged authority. The Christianity that spread throughout Europe, that shaped Western civilization, that built cathedrals and launched crusades, that blessed kings and burned heretics. This was Constantinian Christianity. It contained much that was noble and true. It also contained much that contradicted Jesus' teaching about humility, service, and love for enemies. The texts that were buried at Nag Hammadi remind us of what was lost. They are not necessarily better than what survived, but they are different. They show that other Christianities were possible, that the path Christianity took was not inevitable, that choices were made, choices about which voices to amplify and which to silence, which structures to build and which to suppress. Constantine made those choices, not alone, not arbitrarily, but powerfully. He used his authority to shape Christianity into something that could serve his empire. The bishops who allied with him participated willingly, seeing opportunity for their religion to grow from persecuted minority to dominant institution. Was this divine providence or imperial co-optation? Was Constantine God's instrument or Christianity's corrupter? Was this salvation or betrayal? The answer depends on what you believe Christianity should be. If Christianity is meant to be powerful, institutional, orthodox, and allied with political authority, then Constantine was its saviour. If Christianity is meant to be humble, diverse, prophetic, and suspicious of power, then Constantine was its corrupter. But perhaps the most honest answer is simpler. Constantine was an emperor who used Christianity for imperial purposes. He gave it protection and support, but at the cost of its independence and diversity. He saved it from persecution, but transformed it into something that could persecute. He made it successful at the price of its soul. The Christianity that survived was the Christianity that was useful to an emperor, and that usefulness has shaped every generation since, for better and for worse. The ghosts buried at Nag Hammadi whisper a question that will not be silenced. What might Christianity have become if it had remained what it was before Constantine crowned it with earthly power? We will never know. Constantine made sure of that. But the question haunts us still, as it should, because the choice Constantine made to ally faith with power, to enforce orthodoxy through force to make Christianity useful for empire, that choice echoes through history. Every time Christianity allies with political power, every time churches bless military violence, every time orthodoxy is enforced through coercion, we are living in Constantine's shadow. He conquered Christianity more thoroughly than he ever conquered his enemies, and we are still living in the empire he built, an empire where Christ wears a crown and sits on a throne, where the religion of a crucified criminal has become the voice of power itself. This is Constantine's legacy. Not the conversion of an emperor, but the transformation of a faith. Not the salvation of Christianity, but its conquest. And the cost of that conquest is measured in the silence of the voices that were buried, the texts that were burned, the alternatives that were eliminated. The cost is measured in the centuries of Christians persecuting Christians, of faith enforcing conformity, of the church wielding the sword it was meant to refuse. Constantine saw a sign in the sky. In this sign conquer, and conquer he did. The question is whether what he conquered was his enemies or the faith itself.